In the 1960s and early 1970s, a series of bizarre events occurred in and around Highgate Cemetery in London. A number of sightings of phantoms and specters, particularly of a tall, dark-clad entity with burning eyes, led to speculation the capital had acquired its very own vampire. Reports soon came from Highgate of tombs being broken into, graves and bodies were desecrated, and black magic rituals allegedly performed. Vampire hunters claim to have broken open coffins and plunged stakes into and even burned the corpses of the undead. Newspapers obsessed over these strange occurrences. TV programs were made about a supposed nest of vampires in Highgate Cemetery, and those promising to root out this ancient evil were interviewed. On Friday, 13th March 1970, hundreds of vampire hunters invaded the Victoria graveyard and engaged in a search for what was becoming known as a Highgate vampire. But did any sort of a vampire exist? Who were those self-proclaimed vampire hunters? Some of whom dedicated years to trying to understand the feminine and to hunting the vampire down. And how could a late 20th century city be gripped by a pendulum more at home in the pages of a Victorian gossip novel? It's time to pick up our sticks, grab our bulbs of garden, and go off in search of the elusive Highgate vampire. The roots of Highgate vampire strange sightings decaying graveyard Highgate Cemetery was far more reasonable place than it is now. Once one of London's most fashionable burial grounds, the graveyard was by the 1960s overgrown and neglected. Graffiti were scrawled across the headstones. Vandals have pulled on doors of vaults, cracks, and can be seen everywhere. In some cases, bodies, it's not surprising that the dilapidated grandeur of this cemetery, with its ivy-entwined gossip monuments, will generate a sense of hauntings and sinister creatures, and those with interest in the occult and microbe. It's time for the Highgate. Much of the cemetery was neglected and overgrown. At the time of the Highgate vampire, much of the cemetery was neglected and overgrown. According to David Farce, a young local man with a passion for the paranormal, the first murmuring about a strange being began in late 1969. Farce claimed that he spoke to two people, an old lady who had been out walking her dog and a middle-aged accountant who told similar stories about what they had seen in the cemetery. They told the old lady had been walking down Swan Lane, a road running through the graveyard when she saw a tall, dark figure with glaring eyes that seemed to be floating towards her. She felt the air turn icy cold. The accountant had got lost in the vast cemetery. A bell started to clang, and he walked towards the squad, hoping it would guide him out of the tombs. Instead, the bell tolled. He became aware of something behind him and noticed the temperature plummeting. He turned around to see a tall, dark figure that stared at him intensely before it vanished. Intrigued, Farron decided to investigate by spending a night in the graveyard. Farron said, "At first, I suspected it might just be an animal or, someone dressed up or messing about because all these stories about vampires were in the news." But around midnight, I caught sight of a figure about 7 feet tall that appeared to be floating just above the ground. I saw its face and 2 points of intense red eye. The area turned icy cold as if I would step into a refrigerator. The figure seemed to be draining me of energy. I felt I was losing control of my normal facilities. It felt like a vivid dream that I wanted to wake up. But quickly realizing I was under a tense psychic attack, I repeated a mental incantation used to repel evil forces. It disappeared, but I decided to report where that was true. Friend wrote a letter to a newspaper, the Hampshire and Highgate Express, also known as Ham and High, asking if anyone has anything similar. A number of people responded, saying that they had glimpsed apparitions in Highgate Cemetery and Swain's Lane. These phantoms, though, were of a variety of descriptions, including a tall man wearing a hat, a ghostly cyclist, a lady dressed in white, a face grimacing through the bars of a gate, a person wading to a pond, and pale gliding empty. There were also reports of the sound of bells and voices calling. There was little coherence in the types of specters that people claimed to have seen. But another local young man with an interest in the supernatural, Sean Manchester, was intrigued by what he read, and Manchester would soon make public his ideas about what the apparitions in the graveyard might be. The legend of a Highgate vampire emerged the spring. Farron had never claimed the dark figure he had encountered was a vampire. Sir Manchester had little doubt that a genuine vampire was stalking suburban North London. Manchester contacted the Ham and High, and on 2017 February, the newspaper published the interview entitled as "The Vampire Was from, Highgate," in which Manchester outlined a story to explain the monster's presence. Manchester alleged that the king vampire of the dead was buried in that place. The vampire who in life had been an aristocrat and practitioner of black magic in medieval Romania. He was transported to England by his followers in the early 18th century. The vampire had been was buried in that place. Cemetery and his foreigners also purchased the house of the London and had the fashionable mansion. Vampires' reappearance. Manchester said one was the rituals recently carried out by Satanists in the cemetery had reawakened the evil presence. Manchester had to speak to local people who had experienced vampiric activity. A schoolgirl, Elizabeth, had seen the vampire when walking down the spring lane. Elizabeth began having nightmares in which something evil tried to come into her bedroom. Eventually, 2 wounds appeared on her neck and she started to display symptoms of anemia. Manchester and Elizabeth's boyfriend filled her room with guardian crucifixes and holy water, and her condition soon improved. Manchester spoke to another young woman called Jacqueline, who said she had woken in the night to find something cold clutching her hand. As the next morning, she noticed deep tears in the flesh where she had tried to force her hand free. Jacqueline and her younger brother soon developed a fascination that kept drawing them to the more dilapidated western side of Highgate Cemetery, where Manchester suspected the vampiric infection had occurred. Manchester claimed that after details about the Highgate vampire became public, more people contacted him, and all describing a similar tall dark being with blazing eyes. Could there have been any truth in in this claims about vampires and occult rituals in Highgate Cemetery. In this, in this interview, Manchester didn't supply any proof to back up his ideas about the vampire coming from Eastern Europe. He would later say that the part of the article was a journalistic embellishment. But in a book published in 1985, The Highgate Vampire, Manchester does mention a foreign nobleman's coffin being brought to Highgate there. However, appears there to be more solid evidence concerning the occult ceremonies that Manchester believed were taking place in the graveyard. Farce says that in Highgate Cemetery he often found the discarded remains of Satanist rituals, stubs of black candles, satanic makings on the floors of tombs. In one small chapel-like tomb with a marble floor and stained glass windows, an interpreted pentagram had been drawn on the floor. Like Manchester, felt activities might have woken a long dormant presence. Farce claimed he had researched some, vampires. Some also claims that he have seen the vampires. People seen similar entities in the Victorian epoch. According to Manchester, the police were all aware of black magic practices going on in the cemetery. It's worth pointing out that Farce himself was a member of a group that used the cemetery for rituals, though pagan Wicca was rather than anything satanic. Farce says that his group never interviewed with graves or bodies, but as many of his rituals had to be conducted outdoors, they used the cemetery because it was a secretly open place. In the 1980s, there was another incident that may be very horrible. Satanist witchcraft and teachings of Aleister Crowley, as well as the emergence of a number of less conventional Christian sects. It's clear that an outgrown and secretive place like that cemetery just engaged in more outlandish steps of religious activities carried out in the cemeteries. But little concern in the Highgate Vampire was likely to stay secretive for long. The Highgate Vampire has into limited the hand and high continue to follow the vampire story. We interviewed Farce and Manchester several times over the next month. In an article published on 6th March 1970, Farce said he found dead foxes in the cemetery but couldn't work out how they died. Though he thought a vampire might have been responsible, Manchester claimed he also seen the foxes and suggested the vampire may have been using them as a food source. Soon it was alleged that the animals had been found drained of blood with their throats ripped open. Reports of the Highgate Vampire Commission soon reached the national and even international media. Articles appeared in the national press, TV programs that were made by both TV and the BBC, and even the international news agency Reuters that featured their cause. The anxiety around the Highgate Vampire story was a part of a growing obsession with such creatures in British society. A number of TV programs and horror movies had focused on vampires. One film, the Hammer horror production Tastes the Blood of Dracula, had actually been shot in Highgate Cemetery just a year before the Highgate Vampire incidents began. More chilling, on the night of Halloween 1968, an act of desecration was discovered in the nearby nearby place, flowers that have been taken from graves and arranged in circles with arrows pointing to a new grave, which was uncovered as they have been driving through the coffin and into the heart of the corpse. As interest in the Highgate vampire mounted, a rival grew up between David Farne and Sean Manchester, with each belittling each other's skills as an exorcist and stating that they will be the one to spell her anarchy in Highgate. Farne and Manchester then has filled with each other, Highgate, is also a place that haunted many people. And just the program has also found this, and there are programs that also even include live outside reporting from Highgate Cemetery, with 2 hours of their program being shown. Hundreds of will be vampire hunters that began arriving in the Highgate. This suggests that over the locked gates and walls of the tombs, despite the efforts of their police officers to stop them, the vampire hunters, many arrived with weapons, searched fantastically among the Victorian tombs. Those interviewed as the same appeared to genuinely believe that the vampires think that they were determined to find the monster and put an end to their banditical actions. But however, they didn't find the vampire because vampire maybe don't exist. I don't think they exist. Okay, Manchester later says that the Highgate vampire, provoked place and it displayed the skill of and might forget. Farrant, his opponent, meanwhile, still unconvinced the spooky presence was the vampire. Complained that the media conspiracy and local superstition had turned the Highgate entity into a vampire. On Friday, the 13th, as the amateur vampire hunters swarmed over the cemetery, Manchester and his companions made their way to the entrance of one particular canton. Manchester had previously been won by his smoking girl, who encountered there and bothered by the Highgate vampire and had been exhibiting symptoms similar to Elizabeth. Unable to open the door, the girl used the rope to climb down into the tomb through a window. They found themselves in a vault with several coffins, one of which a sinister-looking casket made of nearly black wood didn't seem to fit. Manchester and his companions performed an exorcism with holy water and garlic, and spring, swirled around. A few months later, on Wednesday, the charred remains that a man found in the tomb. The police suspected the mutilated corpses was caused by black magic. Both Farron and Manchester seemed to become more active. Farron was apprehended by the police in the churchyard next to the cemetery one night, clutching a crucifix and wooden stake. Farron was arrested, but the case against him classed went to a county court. Manchester and his followers, meanwhile, were led to a different family vault by a female psychic helper. Also forcing open the doors, they found black coffins similar to the one they had seen in the tombs. Manchester, suspecting it had been moved by black magic, devotees leveled open the lid and it was only when we discovered the purified chamber on August 1970, we have looked up the horrified occurrence of what was inside. Manchester says that we have absolute confirmation of what we were telling with Manchester wanted to wipe the exploded body, but one member of his entourage persuaded him not to do that because it is illegal in England. Instead, their group performed rituals that used 7 crucifixes, 4 white candles, and 7 cups of holy water in a ceremony carried by 4 men and 1 woman to banish the spirit of evil and evil presence. Using the Latin formula, use of the spoken exorcism did bring a sign of relative living in this area. Manchester says that the cemetery officials had been still the cemetery, and to keep them from entering into the tomb. They decided not to try, and they decided to try to communicate with their entity and discovered its powers in Highgate Cemetery. They conducted rituals using 2 circles, incense, candles, and medium. And for the first time they tried this, the press interrupted them. A year later, according to a found another attempt saw the entity clasping the medium by the scroll. We had to break the circle. The area turned cold. She felt she was being enveloped by a blackness. Sprang to her. Fred was now convinced the entity was malignant. After hearing the incidents in which a sinister force had pushed people over in Springs Lane, he did more search. Fred came up with a theory that the being wasn't a vampire at all, but an evil presence that traveled along a ley line. The ley line began at the clump pole, a part of the cemetery where urns are kept, and across the land. So that's the story of their ridiculous, you know, the ridiculous things that I just can't believe why people will do that. That's just crazy. I can't believe it. As for me, I just think people we should all be rational as to face this problem like this. So I just want to know what you think about this ridiculous things. Just leave your comment below. Thank you.